In the spring of 1945, a construction worker named Eb Cade was lying in a hospital bed in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, with a broken arm and a broken leg. He had been in a car accident on his way to work. He was 53 years old, otherwise perfectly healthy, and he expected the doctors to set his bones and send him home. Instead, they waited. They left his fractures untreated for 20 days. And on the 10th of April, without telling him what they were doing or why, they pushed a needle into his arm and injected him with 4.7 micrograms of plutonium, the most dangerous man-made substance on the planet, in a dose nearly 5 times the amount scientists already believed was the limit a human body could tolerate. Eb Cade was not sick from radiation. He was not being treated. He was being measured. And the men who did it knew exactly what plutonium was, because the entire reason for the experiment was that they understood how lethal it could be. This is the story of how the United States government, in the final years of World War II and the first years of the Cold War. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Turned 18 ordinary hospital patients into test subjects without their knowledge, and how the doctors who ran the program understood from the very beginning that what they were doing would never survive the light of day. To understand why this happened, you have to understand the fear that drove it. By 1944, the Manhattan Project was racing to build an atomic bomb, and it was producing plutonium on an industrial scale for the first time in human history. Plutonium was new. It had barely existed on Earth before scientists made it in their laboratories. And the men handling it, the chemists and the technicians at sites like Los Alamos and Hanford and Oak Ridge, were working with a substance whose effects on the human body were almost completely unknown. Animal studies on rats had already shown something deeply alarming. When plutonium entered the bloodstream, it did not pass through. It settled into the bones and the organs, and it stayed there, emitting radiation from the inside for the rest of a person's life. The leaders of the project realized they had a problem. They had thousands of workers handling this material, and they had no way of knowing how much exposure was too much. They needed a number. They needed to know how the human body absorbed plutonium, how much it retained, and how much it excreted, so they could set safety limits for their own staff. The animal data could only take them so far. A rat is not a man, and the project's physicians argued that the only reliable way to calibrate the danger to a human worker was to study a human body directly. And the only way to get that number, they decided, was to put plutonium into living human beings and then measure what came back out. There is a cold logic to this if you accept the premise, and that premise is the rot at the center of the whole affair. The premise was that the goal mattered more than the person. Once you accept that the data is worth more than the man, everything else follows with terrible efficiency. You do not need his permission, because his permission is an obstacle. You do not need to tell him, because telling him creates risk. You only need a body that absorbs, retains, and excretes, and a quiet ward where the measurements can be taken. The patients were never going to benefit. There was no therapy here, no possibility of a cure. Every injection was administered for the benefit of someone else entirely. For the workers, for the engineers, for the future of the weapons program. The patient simply paid the bill with his own flesh. The medical team, headed by men like Stafford Warren, Joseph Hamilton, Robert Stone, and Louis Hempelman, came up with a plan. They would select hospital patients, inject them with measured doses of plutonium, and then collect their urine, their stool, their blood, and in some cases their tissue, to calculate exactly how the body handled the element. The plan was approved at the highest levels of the project, including with the knowledge of the laboratory director, Robert Oppenheimer. The patients were not volunteers. They did not consent. In most cases, they were never even told that an experiment was taking place. Between April of 1945 and July of 1947, 18 people were injected with plutonium, along with others who received uranium, polonium, and americium. The injections took place at hospitals tied to the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge, in Rochester, in Chicago, and in San Francisco. In Rochester, New York, the work was carried out in a place that tells you everything about the spirit of the program. A small ward was built across the street from the University Medical School, accessible only through an underground tunnel guarded with the same scrutiny applied to the bomb itself. It was called the Manhattan Annex, and inside it patients were studied like specimens, their every excretion measured and logged. The men running these wards were not back alley operators. They were among the most respected physicians and scientists in the country, working at elite universities, publishing in journals, building careers. That is what makes the story so much darker than a simple tale of villains. The cruelty was institutional, methodical, and signed off on by people with impeccable credentials. The people chosen were not powerful, they were vulnerable, and that vulnerability was not an accident. Many were poor, several were black at a time of brutal segregation, some were children, many had been told they were dying, which the doctors saw as convenient because a patient expected to die soon would not live long enough to develop the long-term cancers that plutonium might cause and would not be around to ask questions. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The code names they were given tell you everything about how they were seen. Ebcade, the first, was labelled HP-12. The HP stood for human product. Think about what it took to leave Ebcade's broken bones unset for 20 days. A man comes in from a car accident with fractures in his arm and his leg, in pain, expecting to be fixed. And the doctors deliberately delay treating him, not because they cannot, but because his untreated state is useful to the experiment, because they want to inject him and take samples before they close the case. His pain was simply part of the schedule. When his bones were finally examined, biopsies of the bone and even some of his teeth were taken and shipped off for analysis. He was, in the language of the file, a product, and a product is processed, not healed. Consider Albert Stevens, a house painter from California. He checked into the hospital at the University of California in San Francisco after being diagnosed with what doctors believed was terminal stomach cancer. They told him he had about 6 months to live. In May of 1945, given the code name Cal-1, he was injected with plutonium. But there was a terrible irony buried in his case. The diagnosis was wrong. Albert Stevens did not have terminal cancer at all. He had a benign ulcer. The surgery to remove his supposed tumour took out parts of several organs, and he recovered and went on to live for another 20 years. Which means that for 2 decades, an otherwise healthy man carried one of the largest accumulated radiation doses ever recorded in a human being, walking around, raising his family, never knowing that the government had filled his body with one of the most toxic substances ever created and was quietly tracking him as a data point. Consider Simeon Shaw, a 4-year-old boy brought all the way from Australia to San Francisco in 1946, his family believing he was being taken across an ocean to receive the best possible treatment for his bone cancer. Imagine the hope in that journey. Parents carrying their sick little boy to the other side of the world because they had been promised that American doctors could help him. He was given the code name Cal-2. He was injected with plutonium and other radioactive materials. He was studied and then he was sent home. He died not long after, and his family never knew what had been done to him. The promise of treatment had been the cover story all along. Consider Elmer Allen, a railroad porter from Texas, code-named Cal-3, the last of the plutonium subjects, injected in July of 1947 in a leg the doctors then amputated. He spent the rest of his life telling people that the doctors had put something into him, that they had given him a sickness on purpose. For decades he was not believed. He sounded paranoid. He died in 1991, still not knowing that he had been right all along. And here is the part that turns a tragedy into something colder. The people running this program understood very clearly that it could not be made public. We do not have to guess at their state of mind, because they wrote it down. When the Civilian Atomic Energy Commission took over the program on the first day of 1947, the plutonium injections provoked an immediate reaction at the highest levels. There is a memorandum from April of 1947, a note on the subject of medical experiments on humans, in which the recommendation is plain. The information should not be released, and the reason given was not national security. The reason given was that disclosure might have an adverse effect on public opinion or result in legal suits. Read that again. The concern was not whether the experiment was wrong. The concern was the public finding out, and the lawsuits that would follow. The secrecy was not to protect a weapon. It was to protect the program from accountability. This is where the revisionist lens matters, because the standard story we are told about science in this era is one of noble sacrifice and brilliant men racing to save the world. But follow the money and the institutions, and a different picture emerges. The plutonium injections were, at their core, a cost calculation. A nuclear weapons complex worth billions of dollars needed safety data to keep its workforce productive and to limit its own future liability. Buying that data with the bodies of poor and dying patients was, to the men in charge, simply cheaper and faster than any alternative. The patients generated value, scientific value, economic value, institutional value, and they were never paid, never asked, and never informed. They were a raw material. The code name for Ebcade said it without shame. Human product. For decades it stayed buried. The patients were not told. When follow-up studies were done in the 1970s, some surviving subjects and their families were tracked down and tested again, and still the full truth was withheld. The investigators measured them once more, took fresh samples, recorded the long-term retention of the plutonium in their bodies, and let them go home no wiser than before. The people had become a long-running data set, checked in on across the decades like instruments left running in a field. It was not until a journalist named Eileen Welsom began pulling at the threads in declassified documents in the 1980s that the names behind the code names started to surface. It took her years of patient work to turn a cluster of cold abbreviations CAL1, CAL2, CAL3 back into human beings with families and hometowns and graves. Her work eventually won the Pulitzer Prize and forced the government to confront what it had done. In 1994, President Clinton established an advisory committee on human radiation experiments, and the official investigation that followed confirmed the scale of it. Not just 18 people, but a sprawling landscape of radiation experiments carried out across the country over 3 decades, on prisoners, on patients, on pregnant women, on newborn babies, on children in institutions, often on those least able to refuse and least likely to be believed. The government eventually apologized. Some families received settlements. But an apology arriving 50 years late to people who in many cases were already dead raises a harder question than the one it answers. Because the doctors involved were not monsters in any cartoonish sense. Many were respected scientists who believed they were serving a greater good, protecting future workers, advancing knowledge, winning a war and then a Cold War. They told themselves the ends justified the means. And that is precisely what should unsettle us, because it is the same justification that has been used to excuse exploitation in every era, the idea that some lives are simply worth less, that some bodies can be spent in service of a larger goal decided by people who will never be the ones injected. The 18 people injected with plutonium did not choose to advance human knowledge. They went to hospitals expecting care, and they were used as instruments, their suffering converted into numbers in a classified report. The men who did it knew it was wrong, which is why they hid it, why they classified it, and why they fought for decades to keep the names sealed away. And the system that produced them, a vast and secretive complex where institutional interest outweighed the individual human being, did not vanish when the apology was finally read aloud. The names we should remember are not the ones in the textbooks. They are Ebcade, Albert Stevens, Simeon Shaw, Elmer Allen, and the others whose names we may never fully know. They were not human products. They were people. And the least we can do all these years later is refuse to let the secret stay buried, and refuse to look away from what was done in the dark in our name by men who knew exactly what they were doing.